Okay, hopefully this microphone is working. I'm checking my, connection here. All right, after a bit of a break from having to do all that JC stuff, which still isn't over, but I did reading during that time and got through another chapter. It was a real long one, if you remember, and the next chapter is going to be real good. So we were on, let me find it, Goldwater, the Objectivist, Crack Up, and Hippies on the Right. Trying to find the beginning of the chapter here to start, which was chapter 6. And this is going to be a long segment because this was a long chapter. And I'm trying to get my bearings again since it's been a bit since I had started it. Okay, this is talking about when the Volcker Fund dissolved, basically, stopped supporting libertarians, and it's the guy who ended up being in charge of it, which is Luhnow. It seems to me like he just nutted up a little. So, says Luhnow had adopted shifting pretenses that Volcker had ordered the fund to be liquidated back in 1958, and he was only now getting around to remembering that or telling anyone, and offered no proof of it other than his own apparently recovered memory. The standard story contained in the Luhnow-sponsored William Volcker biography by Herbert Cornell, and repeated by Luhnow to his employees, is that Volcker decreed a lifespan of 30 years after his death on the fund, which should keep the fund alive until 1977. But on different occasions, Luhnow would say the fund would die with him, or die any time he chose to kill it, which is how it turned out. No one seems sure why Luhnow made this decision, or Luhnow. Ivan Beerley at the fund, one of Luhnow's closest confidants, had, some insisted, been converted to the radical Christian philosophy of Reverend Rousas J. Rushdoony. Now that's just a funny intersection of different life experiences, because back when I was very, very active in the theology debate forum I owned, very familiar with Rushdoony and theonomics. Rushdoony is a scary character. A philosophy that had become institutionalized under the rubric, it just says here Reconstructionism, but it was called Christian Reconstructionism. It calls for a return to a strict interpretation of Old Testament rules as a proper constitution for civil government. This would result in a bizarre political program of no interference with economic activity. So it was this weird, in some sense, libertarian, and that's where Gary North comes out of. I think it ends up mentioning this, with dutiful stoning of adulterers and homosexuals. And Murray Rothbard's judgment, Beerley managed to convince the increasingly senile Luhnow that the Volcker Fund, especially F.A. Harper, Kenneth Templeton, George Resch, and Rothbard, had fallen into the hands of a dangerous anarchist, pacifist, atheist clique out to subvert the Volcker Fund's Christian mission. So for whatever reason, the anarcho-libertarian cadre had lost its major, and in many cases only, source of cash support and organization. Harper was forced to scrape together some semblance of his Institute for Humane Studies dream without Volcker money, and he struggled with it throughout most of the 1960s. The Institute got rolling in earnest by the 1960s. George Resch, Harper's right-hand man, had to go back to college. Rothbard still had enough Ayn Rand in him to talk with a bitterness somewhat mock and somewhat real, got it, of how they might have all have to take jobs at the quarry, a la Howard Rourke. Okay. And here, moving on a little bit, it's like jumping from person to person, where it said there was the establishment of the Foundation for Voluntary Welfare, which was done by Dick Cornell, who could no longer abide by the Randian idea that no one owed anything to those who couldn't succeed under capitalism, and I would agree with him. We might not owe anyone under justice, but I do think we do under morality. Cornell thought there would be no way for libertarian ideas to win out unless people could see that a free market wouldn't mean widespread unaided destitution. Agreed. That the state wasn't needed to make sure those in need of help got help. And his old friend Rothbard, who had been especially proud of Cornell, in Rothbard's own estimation, his first recruit to anarcho-capitalism, groused, that's another word we don't hear often, at seeing him win press attention and praise for his new dispensation, while he denigrated the libertarian movement from which he arose for its heartlessness regarding human misery. Then, it's moving on to Milton Friedman, with the title of the chapter being, I Thought I Was Going Back to Some Fundamentals Rather Than Creating Anything New. Who is calling me? I think I'm getting a Facebook. I can't figure out where that beeping is coming from. Can you hear that? I'm concerned that you may be able to hear that. Or is it just me? Weird. It was Facebook. I'll have to go back to that. I think that was JJ calling me. Well, we shall see. Don't want to interrupt this. It says, what has never been controversial about Friedman is his status as one of the most accomplished and influential technical economists of his era, as well as one of the most effective proselytizers for the political philosophy of extremely limited government, libertarianism. Friedman's success at influencing and appealing to mainstream conservative thought has inspired conservatives to embrace him as their own, an embrace Friedman has often struggled to escape. Did not want to be a conservative. And then it talks about his son, David Friedman, who became an economist and leading advocate of anarcho-capitalism. I'm much more a fan and familiar with David Friedman. And it says, now is this of David or Milton? So hard to say. This, of course, I'm looking through highlights, but I believe this is still talking about Milton, where it says he has been remarkably successful at making the radical almost mainstream. Yeah, this is definitely talking about Milton. Or did it? Well, I guess we'll figure it out, because it's talking about World War II, and his son David is younger than that. World War II, as it did for most men of his generation, disrupted what might have been Friedman's normal career pattern. After a year teaching at the University of Wisconsin, Friedman worked in the U.S. Treasury's Tax Research Division. I hope you don't hear that ringing. He really wants to talk to me. I'm going to need to call him back. There, he was partially responsible for a policy decision that, to this day, his libertarian wife, as well as other libertarians, excoriates him. He developed the withholding system for the income tax. Boo, hiss. They wanted, Friedman said, to raise as much in taxes as they could. See how war spawned so many civil liberty violations. You could not do that in wartime or in peacetime without withholding. And so people at the Treasury Tax Research Department, where I was working, investigated various methods of withholding. I was one of the very small technical group that worked on developing it. Sackcloth and ashes, Milton. Sackcloth and ashes. We were just asking ourselves, what can we do to win the war? I have no apologies for it, but I really wish we hadn't found it necessary to do that. And I wish there was some way of abolishing withholding now. Libertarians think paycheck withholding makes it easy for citizens to not notice how much they are paying for the privilege of being governed, and that is absolutely true. Millions actually feel grateful come April when some of the money taken from them is returned. This lowers the political cost to government of taxing, a result libertarians lament. Now, it deals now with the book, which I say read in quotes. When I listen to books, I count them as reading. So I'm not so sure it's the same thing. I mean, you get the information. Oh, and Jonathan is asking me to call him, so I will call him. But you don't get it in exactly, like, you don't digest it the same way. So I like to keep these little recordings I'm doing to 10 minutes at a pop, even though you get them in one long chunk, because I have to transfer them from my phone, and sometimes I've been having problems with that. And apparently JJ wants to talk to me. All right, I called him back, and now we can continue. And I marked the page. So it's going talking about Milton Friedman's book. Capitalism and Freedom came early in his career and before most of his fame. He traces the intellectual roots of the book, a sustained, even-handed assessment of how, where, and why government fails and private markets are better, both morally and practically, to attending the first Mount Pelerin Society meeting and being exposed to the give and take, support, and sense of community among international libertarian scholars and advocates. His presence at the first Pelerin meeting was also due to Volcker Fund largesse. Friedman also thanks the group of students who gathered around Hayek during his stint at Chicago's Committee on Social Thought during the 50s and 60s for creating a pleasingly libertarian atmosphere around Chicago. This gang, spearheaded by Circle Bastiat mainstays Ralph Raico and Ronald Hamowy, produced the New Individualist Review, an early and well-respected libertarian college magazine that Friedman advised. And that book influenced a lot of young libertarians, even though some who had already been dedicated to the libertarian cause considered it soft on the state in parts. And when I had listened to it, I felt the same way. Friedman has never shown much interest in arguing basic questions of why liberty. He simply assumes that men of goodwill favor the same things, peace and prosperity, and patiently explains why freedom will bring them in the most efficient way possible. Capitalism and Freedom still opens young libertarians' eyes to the proper role of government. It contains almost all the themes and ideas Friedman would continue to advocate over the course of his career as a columnist, author, and speaker on public policy issues. Friedman grants the government responsibility for more than the two functions libertarians traditionally assign it of defense and domestic peace, protecting us from enemies internal and external. He credits it also with responsibility for fostering competitive markets, boo, hiss, and enabling us at times to accomplish jointly what we would find it more difficult or expensive to accomplish severally. And he grants this area is fraught with danger. We don't need the government's help to do that. Friedman explains how markets permit unanimity without conformity. We can all get our desires for products and services met in a free market, even if what we want is not the same as what the majority wants, which provides an effective proportional representation that mere democracy never can. Much of the rest of Capitalism Freedom focuses on Friedman's particular concerns as a monetary economist. He spends chapters arguing against commodity standards, the notion that money ought to be only gold or other metals. Interesting. His rejection of the gold standard is another aspect that pisses off Austrian libertarians, as it just triggered me, who think that only gold prevents government from manipulating the money supply easily to its own advantage. I'm not so sure they think it's only gold. I think if somebody came up with another standard that had the same characteristics, they would be fine with that. I don't think they fetishize gold. It's the characteristics that gold possesses. He explains how unions help cartelize, I wonder how you pronounce that, to the consumer's detriment. Anti-union sentiment is almost universal among libertarian intellectuals. I'm not anti-union. I'm anti the way unions are forced on people. Attack the idea of corporate responsibility. He thinks that a corporation's responsibility to its shareholders is simply to make profits. Individual shareholders should be able to decide for themselves how much of their money they want going to other causes, not have that decision made for them by corporate executives. Then don't invest in that corporation. Though I'm not in favor, I don't think corporations are libertarian at all, but just like accepting that as true for the sake of argument, I don't know. And corporate taxes explains how professional licensure is just a tool to allow professionals to block competition. True. And neither ensures quality or helps consumers. True. Advocates the flat tax. Boo. And defends the fact that free markets will necessarily lead to inequality of income. Accepts the need for government income floors, but advocates a negative income tax. Boo. A set stipend that you could spend as you wished in a free market, which would just effectively make that zero. We can get into that some other time. As a replacement for all current social welfare programs, wouldn't stay that way. As the cheapest, least bureaucratic, and most economically efficient way to help the poor. I would think that the free market would be the best determiner of that and not a government program. This idea entered the serious debate over poverty programs before the decade ended, another sign of Friedman's influence above and beyond the limits of the libertarian movement, where libertarians seem to be talking to themselves for so long. And now it's going back to Circle Bastiat members Rako and Hamaway, who won admission to the Chicago Schools Committee on Social Thought and studied under Hayek. It said Hamaway also took aim at his own beloved Professor Hayek in an analysis of the unlibertarian nature of Hayek's definition of coercion, which we talked about earlier. Hamaway thought it allowed far too much state action by declaring that any state restriction that was pre-announced and applied equally to all did not qualify as coercion. And he's correct. The libertarians at New Individualist Review seem to be baiting the conservatives among them. Ed Facey, a Mises student from NYU, admitted that libertarians only talked about the Constitution tactically. Bingo. As an aid in their Fabianism in reverse, the Socialist Fabians of England took over the institutions of government without necessarily stating their end goals. The libertarians hoped to do the same, to move back from socialism to liberty, to shrink the U.S. government. But I do believe in stating the end goals. So maybe I am not particularly understanding Fabianism. I understand Fabianism as very tactical incrementalism. But I guess they did hide their end goals, now that I'm thinking about it. I just never really synthesized it that way. But they must have talked about it amongst themselves, or it just happened organically. Like, was Fabianism I don't know enough about it. This could be a dumb question. A planned thing, or did it just happen? While Chicago students were presenting an intellectually radical libertarianism in academia, under the smiling eyes of Hayek and Friedman, the world of presidential politics was also offering something for libertarians, young libertarians especially, to get excited about. Now it's moving into the Goldwater campaign, which is something I was excited to learn about, because I didn't know too much about it except anecdotally and, in shadowy form, I guess it would say. So here's the title of this subsection is Goldwater and the Conservative Movement are not only libertarian, but the preeminent enemy. Oh, excuse me. Start over. Goldwater and the conservative movement are not only not libertarian, big difference, but the preeminent enemies of liberty of our time. And that's not a sentiment I had heard before I'd read this. The 1964 Goldwater presidential campaign was a revivifying moment for the modern libertarian movement. unwittingly fomenting new energy and new recruits for a political tendency more radical than the Arizona senator himself, and ultimately radical in different directions. So was what I had heard kind of like a projection of what people hoped he stood for rather than what he actually stood for? The next highlighted thing answers my question. Some were so dazzled that they saw him as the walking, breathing embodiment of everything Ayn Rand stood for. John Galt in a fighter plane. Even Rand herself was a measured supporter. Radical libertarianism was shot through the Goldwater moment, but with small caliber ammo. Right, I'm stopping at this 10-minute mark to keep my recording manageable, but just for reference sake, like we're on page 310, and this chapter that I've read through and highlighted goes up to 387, so there is quite a bit to go through. I'm re-recording this section because when I did it this morning, I didn't have any of the, so I do it with this wireless thing. See the green lights? The green lights weren't on earlier. So we're continuing. The Goldwater story, inspirational for ideological political outsiders of any stripe, of how a squad of activists with no power center in a major party, lacking even the wholehearted support of their supposed standard bearer, catapulted their man to a presidential nomination, suffered a crushing defeat, and then saw their ideas percolate and grow and eventually win the presidency 16 years later, with Ronald Reagan has been told elsewhere. Now, it's very interesting. If he was indeed, which we're going to see Rothbard's opinion, that how Goldwater wasn't a libertarian, but if he was, it does give hope for us, or a model for us on how our ideas can still win. And it is not, despite some of Goldwater's rhetoric, and despite the effort that he undoubtedly had on many young libertarians, a strictly libertarian story, as the previous sentence just showed. Not for nothing was his book called Conscience of a Conservative, and none of the inner circle of the draft Goldwater movement, nor many of his inner circle of advisors, except Freedman, were libertarians at the time, though one prominent convert, Carl Hess, very prominent in the libertarian movement, Libertarian Party, about whom more later, would arise from the very bosom of Goldwaterism. Goldwater won the hearts of many prominent libertarians for being the only major political figure who even seemed to think, at times at least, that the New Deal needed to be rolled back, even though he was not across the board reliable even on this. And we don't think of it today as the New Deal, but the policies that came out of that, even the Republicans hold sacrosanct, like Social Security. Politicians, as Leonard Read always argued, are lagging indicators, not leading ones. That is just, his hair is all puffy. That is definitely the truth. Once the libertarian educational missions had progressed enough, then the politicians would naturally fall in line. Benjamin Rogue, a libertarian economics professor at Wabash College and Reed's choice to succeed him at FEE, noted that the great mistake was made, not during the campaign, but precisely when those conservatives who pride themselves on being activists and on knowing how to get things done decided that conservatism could be brought to America by what amounted to a political coup. Goldwater's campaign could not build on any solid foundation of widely accepted ideas on society, economics, and the state. Basically saying, and I've said this in regards to like the abortion issue, until you change the culture, changing the laws would be one of the worst things that could happen for the movement. But Rothbard, ever contrary, could not be satisfied by the occasional rhetorical sops that Republican politicians throw toward libertarian ideas. He was appalled by widespread libertarian enthusiasm for Goldwater. though Rothbard had supported Stevenson over Eisenhower in 1956 because he thought him less bellicose about the Soviets. Now here's what Rothbard had to say. I simply cannot understand how you can regard Goldwater as a libertarian or general liberal in any sense, he wrote. I would like, in fact, for you to point to one specific mainstay of the current status system that Goldwater proposes to repeal. It has become clear that Goldwater does not propose to eliminate even the graduated features of the income tax, let alone repeal the income tax altogether. He does not propose to make Social Security voluntary or to sell TVA to private enterprise. On the Union side, Goldwater shows no signs of calling for a repeal of the Wagner-Taft-Hartley Act structure. Instead, he wants to add more status depression on labor relations by subjecting unions to antitrust laws and passing right-to-work laws which prohibit employers from making voluntarily closed-shop agreements with unions. Goldwater's choice of economic advisors makes it clear that he would support a Keynesian fiscal policy of greater government spending in recessions. I conclude then that Goldwater's supposed pro-libertarian views are meaningless political rhetoric cut off from any specific application. Goldwater and the conservative movement are not only not libertarian, but the preeminent enemies of liberty of our time. For the Goldwaterites first are aggressive and ardent champions of American imperialism and intervention in political and military affairs all over the globe. And second, and most important, are eager advocates of nuclear war against the Soviet Union. The threat and reality of nuclear annihilation is the great threat, far more intensely and widely than domestic statism to the lives and liberties of Americans and indeed of the human race itself. Those libertarians who believe in taking part in the political process should bend their every effort to defeat Barry Goldwater and all Goldwaterites candidates in November. Now it's moving on to the next subchapter. One of the most important libertarian institutions of the 1960s was a school known originally as the Freedom School and later Rampart College in Colorado, and I wish our two time frames intersected. I would have loved to have seen this. It was founded and run by former radio announcer, actor, traveling salesman, and one-time acolyte to ancient ascended masters, suffused with direct, pure light wisdom beamed from the noggin of the living but ethereal Saint Germain. The Freedom School's master was blessed with the mellifluous name of Robert Lefebvre. And speaking of Robert, his ideas, though on the surface within the libertarian mainstream, the anarchist eddy at least, took some curious turns that ultimately consigned Lefebvre to the role, from today's perspective, of mostly forgotten influence. But his direct disciples include some of the most important and influential figures in the libertarian movement's future, from Roy Childs, 1970s editor of the magazine Libertarian Review, to free market environmentalism pioneer R.J. Smith, to Charles and David Koch, a pair of brothers who became the biggest source of funding for libertarian causes in the 1970s and beyond. And we get accused of it all the time. So I'm like, give me that sweet Koch money. I wish we were still getting it in the Libertarian Party. Lefebvre's heresy was his conclusion that retaliatory force was just as morally problematic as any other kind of force. Lefebvre preached a thoroughgoing pacifism that held it to be an impermissible violation of the property rights of an assailant to destroy the ropes he tied you up with, just as long as they were his ropes, and just as bad to take a necklace from a blackguard who stole it from you as it was for the blackguard to take it from you in the first place. I don't understand that term, like today, just saying it like it's like, what, is that a racist thing? He isn't saying two words, blackguard. He said blackguard. That must have been some kind of movement or label in the time for somebody violent, at least from the context. It was slow getting this Freedom School going, even in the beginning. Lefebvre succeeding in getting the greatest stars in the libertarian sky to come out to the Colorado mountains and shine. He was, though, capable of facing down angry lieutenant colonels who raged at his pacifist refusal to fight for the flag and explaining his theory of human rights so patiently, so guilelessly, that in the end, the crusty colonel, and obviously, this is a piece out of a larger story. I'm not getting into who the colonel was or any of that, because that's not really the point I wanted to deal with here. Had to admit that Lefebvre was right to stand his ground. He may not have been for everyone, but those who loved him passionately. And that kind of describes me in a way, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not that extreme of a pacifism, but I make people feel something. And not for everybody, but those who love me passionately. Some found his approach to libertarian education so eccentric, so dangerous, that he simply had to be stopped. In 1965, Lefebvre launched the first semi-scholarly journal dedicated to modern anarchist libertarianism, the Rampart Journal of Individualist Thought. It featured, among other interesting examples of mid-1960s libertariana, like that, Roy Child's first public explanation of why objectivism necessarily implied anarchism, an early version of what became a remarkably popular tool for retailing libertarianism, now known as the Nolan chart, a two-dimensional grid of political ideology beyond just left and right, in which libertarianism seemed to have a place, and one of those explorations beloved by libertarians into obscure human communities that lacked the sort of government we have and yet still survived, in this case, Pashtun tribes in Afghanistan. And it goes on to talk about the history of the college and the way it was devastated by a mudslide. And it says the college never recovered from the mudslide, and Lefebvre's heart broke. He couldn't even bear to even drive by the site in later years. He sold it to the Mennonites to use as a mountain retreat for troubled boys. In 1968, he moved to Orange County, California, where the Rampart College lived on after a fashion, but it was a very different libertarian movement by then. I'd like to find where this site was and drive by it and just salute Robert Lefebvre. It says, imagine you paid for a series of lectures on liberty. You were afraid they might be a little dull, but you found yourself electrified by an entirely new way of seeing life, of conceptualizing the human social order and how to make it work best for everyone. You were mostly interested in science and engineering and never knew that political, social, and moral sciences could be so rigorous, so well organized, so convincing and deductively solid. You were excited, burning to tell your associates and friends what was so special about this particular lecturer, a man of the physical sciences like yourself, a man who really got to the core of why liberty was vital and what its diligent pursuit really implied. He was a former astrophysicist by the name of Andrew Joseph Galambos, teaching in Southern California under the rubric of the Free Enterprise Institute. But you couldn't say a word, because if one of the very interesting new ideas that Galambos had convinced you of was true, you had to honor his primary property, his ideas, to the extent that you were not free to share them with someone who hadn't paid Galambos for them. You couldn't even share why you couldn't explain it. It led to some awkward conversations. And God, this is like intellectual property on crack. As libertarianism's comic historian Jerome Tessul presented his meeting with a Galambosian. There are 5 legitimate functions of government, said the Galambosian. No kidding, what are they? I'm not at liberty to say. The theory was originated by Andy Galambos, and it is his primary property. The Galambosian also informed me that Andy had introduced to Ayn Rand several years before, and that after 5 minutes of conversation they had pronounced each other insane. Of course it is Miss Rand who is really insane, said the Galambosian. Why is that? I'm afraid I can't tell you. The reasoning behind that story belongs to Andy. If the rest of us were free to discuss his ideas, said the Galambosian, there would be no question in my mind that Galambosianism would spread throughout the world like wildfire. Crazy. Primary property was his one unusual innovation, and that's all anyone remembers about him now. Rothbard found Galambos congenial at first, but when he found out about the primary property business, he could only shake his head. He noticed that if libertarians thought they had trouble now with people thinking libertarianism was inherently anti-poor, what would critics say when they learned about the libertarian who thought poor people shouldn't even be able to talk to each other without paying whoever owned whatever ideas or concepts they discussed? I tend to agree there. And then here's another periodical, The Innovator, which defined its audience as the libertarian, the truly radical rightist, who seeks complete freedom to live his life for his own sake, complete freedom from initiated violence or threat of violence by government bodies. In this respect, the libertarian is an extremist, and properly so. A political moderate is one who entertains the notion that a little slavery is a good thing. The zine was started by Tom Marshall, an engineer/nerd type from Los Angeles, and one of the earliest libertarians to theorize about and plan for the creation of new libertarian countries, including, he hoped, ones on a platform floating in the ocean. He became discouraged at the increasingly obvious practical difficulties of the scheme, and by its rejection from his hero Ayn Rand. Along with his new country project, which he pursued under the name Preform, he also started The Innovator to discuss and explore the ideas and applications that Preform-style, purely libertarian life would require. Innovator took an increasingly cranky tone as the decade wore on. What had once been merely one of its interests became the dominant one by 1968. It arose from Marshall's Preform progress. The actual plan to create the island nation faded soon enough, but the ideology, which became known as Libertarian Zionism, remained. The idea that the only way to find freedom in this unfree world was to hide from or physically escape the eyes of the state. A libertarian is almost by definition an eccentric. These guys push the boundaries of mental utopianism with articles on designing a new, more rational alphabet. Just looking at how much more we have in this chapter. Whew. And then it evolved into Discordianism, which is a whole other topic that I did delve into a bit before. Not on a video or anything like that. I'm just saying in my personal life. Discordianism became the heart of the most influential libertarian novel since Atlas Shrugged, though its libertarianism is not always recognized by the more economistic libertarian movement types. And this was Robert Shea and Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy. While working with Innovator, Thornley also became an advocate of early free love cult Charista, which neo-pagan historian Margot Atler credits as the true beginnings of the neo-pagan movement in contemporary culture. He was simultaneously hanging around with ultra-right, anti-commie, quasi-revolutionaries, the Minutemen. Innovator founder Tom Marshall's fate was similar in a way. He became the patron saint of what would be condemned by Murray Rothbard as the libertarian deviation of retreatism, the idea that the state was irredeemably corrupt and more or less impossible to fight, so the only option for liberty is to escape all the entrapping accoutrements of status life, homes or apartments, jobs, streets, and post offices, and taxmen and traffic cops, and retreat to the woods or even caves. This became widely talked about in the movement, if not actually practiced. The would-be cave dweller had a widely understood name, Trog, for troglodyte. Marshall ultimately embraced an even more radical and individualistic version of the preform idea, which he dubbed Vonu, an invented word meaning a life outside the reach of any who could oppress you. In practice, it meant hiding in the woods in Oregon, where he managed to disappear from the sight or knowledge of anyone who ever knew him. His ultimate fate is unknown. That is interesting. Until 1972 or so, he communicated via mail from a P.O. box in Oregon and occasionally trained others in Vonu living, arranging meetings through code words and whistles at the rendezvous spot. That would be a fascinating research project as to what happened to him. Okay, that's it for this reading, and I'll record more. Okay, the objectivist movement, in contrast, was meant to be an island of peerless rationality that guaranteed happiness. Students of objectivism everywhere were rudely awakened from their dream of a happy clan of objectivist heroes in 1968 by a mysterious set of inexplicable actions from their goddesses and gods, disguised revelations about fatally flawed human experiences in practicing the objectivist theory of romantic love. Rand had put her love affair with Brandon in abeyance during her post-Atlas depression, but as she tried to resume it in the mid-1960s, Brandon, not willing to go back there, admits he began to try to please Rand in other ways, with his ruthless moral condemnation of others. Objectivism, which spat on the Christian imperative to judge not lest ye be judged, in favor of judge and be prepared to be judged, expected and demanded constant scanning of everyone and everything for any failing short of full moral righteousness, any failures in total adherence to objectivist principle. The moral goal was complete purity at all times. Although objectivism was officially an atheistic philosophy with no explicit room for sin, irrationality, irrationality and moral failings were treated like sins. But for years, Rand missed the most irrational moral failing of all on the part of her chief enforcer. Brandon kept putting off Rand's demands for a more thorough resumption of the happy sexual affair they had once reveled in. He was certain disaster would strike if he told her he had begun an affair with a young objectivist, a budding actress named Patricia, who had adopted the Randian surname of Wynand. Nathaniel and Barbara had officially separated after many unhappy years, and Nathaniel let slip to Barbara news of his affair with Patricia. Brandon believed Rand was so irrational on the subject of age and sex that she could never understand or permit Brandon to end their sexual relationship without destroying all that the two of them had built to promote objectivism. Barbara was appalled and frightened. She knew Nathaniel and Rand's relationship, a relationship of any sort, would not survive Rand's learning of this affair. While positing herself as the most rational person who ever lived, who understood and controlled every emotion and could trace it clearly to the roots and objective reality that caused them, Rand was still a woman, still had vanity, and would not take well to hearing she was being sexually rejected for a beautiful woman decades her junior. Rand finally told Ein that he was no longer and could never again be her lover. He did not mention Patricia. Ein was outraged but struggled to maintain a professional relationship to keep NBI and the larger objectivist movement afloat. NBI, flush with success, had just taken out a long-term lease on office space in the Empire State Building, the greatest of great skyscrapers, to Rand, the mightiest symbol of man's glory and achievement. Rand had expunged Nathaniel from her will and told Barbara that she was now Rand's sole heir. Barbara rebelled at keeping Nathan's confidence any longer, deciding she could not in good conscience continue to deceive Ein under these circumstances. When Ein learned the whole truth about why and for whom she was being abandoned by her young protege and lover, she was both devastated and enraged. She summoned Nathaniel to her presence, forcing him to sit in her foyer. He was no longer to be permitted the intimacy of her living room. There she administered a final condemnation, a ferocious performance that ended with her thundering at him, "If you have an ounce of morality left in you, an ounce of psychological health, you'll be impotent for the next 20 years. She slapped him 3 times and it was over. The sound of her hand on Nathaniel's face heralded the end of the Nathaniel Branden Institute and the end of any significant attempts to expand objectivism's public impact. Rand continued desultorily to issue the Objectivist magazine, giving it up in 1971 in favor of the Ayn Rand letter, consisting of 4-page personal essays by Rand, mostly commenting sourly on current events. She got further and further behind schedule and finally gave up entirely in 1976. Her productive life was over. She talked for years about writing a complete book-length summation of objectivism and made some notes toward this project, but it was never finished. Rand, according to Barbara, insisted on unquestioning loyalty from both friends and students on this matter. Suddenly, the Brandens were persona non grata amongst all their colleagues and friends of the past decade. Among objectivists across the country, friend turned against friend, families split into warring factions, husband raged at wife, and young people at parents. Those who attempted to question Ayn's demand for loyalty in the absence of knowledge, or who refused to take sides, were denounced. Rand failed in foiling Branden's career. He had since become a successful therapist and author of popular psychology books, mostly centered around his theories of self-esteem. Brand gave equal emphasis to paying attention to one's emotions, not using them as tools of cognition or orders to act, but noticing them, not repressing them, and always trying to understand their rational or experiential roots. Branden moved to Los Angeles, where he still lives, and became therapist to many libertarian activists. He still speaks regularly to libertarian groups, and to the extent that a libertarian society requires self-realized, self-responsible people, which he believes it does, Branden considers his work in psychology to be an extension of his interest in political liberty. While Rand's objectivist movement was growing and then imploding throughout the 1960s, Rothbard, already estranged from her, found himself estranged even from his beloved Mises and his circle over disagreements on foreign policy and imperialism. From that estrangement, he tried to forge his own distinct libertarian intellectual activist movement. In his introductory essay in the first issue of a magazine called Left and Right, Rothbard went public and tough with his total abandonment of conservatism and the right. They were the party of reaction, the party that longed to restore the hierarchy, statism, theocracy, serfdom, and class exploitation of the old order. He admitted that the new left had not worked out a systematic ideology, a coherent vision of the society it wished to bring about, but praised it for what it doesn't like, what it opposes, even if its vision of the ultimate future is a bit cloudy. After generations of inculcation of the virus of positivism and utilitarianism, a virus that helped atrophy the moral fervor of each successive generation, it is magnificent to see morality once again used to pass swift and final judgment on American institutions. Using a proper understanding of history to buttress libertarian understanding became a recurring theme in Rothbard's writing, and it went beyond foreign policy. Naming the real actors who made bad things happen leaves you open to being called names yourself, such as conspiracy theorist. Rothbard preferred calling such scholarship and polemic power elite analysis. As a Miesian praxeologist, Rothbard naturally preferred to study the state's growth in terms of specific human actions, not just historical forces. Still, his outreach to the left did find some prominent converts, including former Students for a Democratic Society head Carl Oglesby, who found Left and Right the most useful magazine I've seen, and I wish there were 100 back issues I could buy. Upon discovering the Rothbard Ligio synthesis, he knew that many of those now on the right ought to be on the left, and vice versa. The issue becomes neither capitalism versus socialism, nor Americans versus Russians, but the big centralized state versus people. People in the new left are immediately open to this idea. We are to wonder now if one Bob Taft might not be more useful in the current situation than a dozen RFKs. The left-right Rothbardian synthesis was also pulling in youngsters from the objectivist right, some of whom retained a mordant, self-deprecating humor about the whole thing. In 1968, Rothbard's stature within the leftist movement rose when the leading lefty magazine Ramparts ran his lengthy declaration of old right solidarity with the new left. The right wing's general sententious pining for supposedly better days gone by sent the modern urban Rothbard into conniptions. Rothbard was also running as far and as fast as he could from the Randite National Associations of Manufacturers' heritage of painting big business as necessarily heroic, or in excusing its obvious playing along with, or even active encouragement of, statist shenanigans as merely unwillingly giving in to government pressure, or as an unwitting result of brainwashing by leftist intellectuals. Rather, following in the tradition of most famously leftist historian Gabriel Kolko, Rothbard and Liggio studied and spoke of how many regulations were in fact ginned up and supported by the very businesses they were meant to be regulating. I am convinced that one of the really big reasons that libertarianism is not making headway among intellectuals is precisely this huge blind spot toward big business in which most of our libertarians indulge. The intellectuals see this, and therefore they cannot be much blamed for rejecting the whole thing as a front for big business. There are many young lads of the New Left who are enormously susceptible to libertarian ideas, who are in reality libertarians and not socialists as most people believe, but who, not knowing economics and seeing supposed free marketeers engaging in apologies for big business, flounder around with no sense of direction. Rothbard left into the nascent Peace and Freedom Party in 1968 and ended up in a tactical alliance with the Maoist Progressive Labor Party for complicated inter-party faction fighting reasons. Rothbard became more and more excited about the rising student anti-war left as the 1960s wore on. Even their apparent attacks on property delighted him. The libertarian must cheer any attempt to return stolen governmental property to the private sector, whether it be in the cry, the streets belong to the people, or the parks belong to the people, or the schools belong to those who use them, i.e. the students and faculty. Slogans such as death to the state and power to the people sounded right to him. Rothbard had begun conceptualizing a fully revolutionary strategy for libertarianism. In the early 1969, he published a strategy memo in the Libertarian Amateur Press Association publication, Libertarian Connection. In it, he analyzed 4 libertarian movement strategies he found wanting. 1, mere educationism of the fee variety. 2, quick buck thinking, where libertarians, to insulate themselves from statism, merely tried to do well for themselves financially. This attitude, still young in the movement, would grow into the libertarian, hard money, gold bug movement that had its heyday in the 1970s. And 3, retreatism, looking for new countries, hidden places in the woods, and so on, where libertarians would live only for and with themselves, as per the strategy that Tom Marshall had championed with Preform and Banu. And 4, pure new left-style cultural rebellion against the status quo. Rothbard advocated instead an inchoately sketched revolutionary style, Lenin-inspired in method, though not in eventual goal, with a professional cadre pursuing a 2-pronged strategy, a public outreach organization and an internal, pure cadre gang to ensure the hardcore remained hard. No use educating publicly for libertarianism, after all, if you couldn't ensure that what the professional libertarians taught was proper libertarianism. Rothbard was a student of, and now enthusiastic participant in, the hallowed Western radical tradition of tiny, united but fractious gangs, self-consciously conspiring to change the world. Something I'm noting here, though, is, I don't know if you caught it, the whole king pill type thing was something Rothbard back in the early 70s, late 60s, was already arguing against. Let me repeat it. He called it quick buck thinking, where libertarians, to insulate themselves from statism, merely tried to do well for themselves financially. That's exactly what, like, that king pill stuff boils down to, at least that I've seen, the post-libertarianism, as if there's something new. Well, they were around, and Rothbard was already arguing against them. Okay, next we will be talking about Karl Hess, the Field Marshal of the Revolution. Okay, we are back. So, to the Field Marshal of the Revolution. Karl Hess was a paradigmatic movement libertarian, more important ultimately for his image and actions as an activist and public figure than for contributions as a thinker or philosopher. And I'm there for that, you know. We need more activists to act on the philosophy. Critics, of whom Hess had a few, thought his role in the libertarian movement was a triumph of style over substance. Though Hess dabbled in Rand-sounding rights language in some of his writings, he had a restless intellect, not one to settle on and doggedly stick to definite answers. His libertarianism came down to an aesthetic love of liberty and an appreciation of the power of technology and tools over ideologies. Even Jesus Christ, said Hess, paled as an influence on human history before the humblest maker of tools. And he said that he learned his lessons on not really caring what other people think. Young, it says, when walking ill-clothed through a fancy hotel as a kid, obviously embarrassed, his mother publicly lectured him on the unimportance of what other people think. And anti-communism became Karl Hess's passion. And he worked at Newsweek, and his enthusiasm for Joseph McCarthy, of all people. But, as we've since learned, McCarthy in some ways was right. And radical anti-communism was his undoing. Hess, ever the romantic, claims to have been the only inner circle member who steadfastly believed Goldwater would win until all the poll results were in that sad day in November in early 1964. But after that day, Goldwaterites were mud in GOP circles. Hess continued working with Goldwater, even past the days when Hess no longer considered himself a right-winger, ghosting newspaper columns for him and continuing to contribute the occasional speech. In 1967, Hess published In a Cause That Will Triumph, a book that still flew the banner of Goldwaterism. Hess blamed his man's defeat on continual media misrepresentation of what Goldwater really thought and believed. Then he read Murray Rothbard's article in Rampart magazine and discovered he wasn't crazy and he wasn't alone, that there was a real link between the right-wing spirit of his old ideological home and the new left he was increasingly attracted to. Unlike the staid, culturally conservative Rothbard, Hess went all the way with the New Left, not just ideologically, but organizationally and sartorially, I guess that's the way you pronounce it, as well. He began sporting a Castro-esque beard and field jacket and came across, as Jerome Tusil put it in his satirical look at the early libertarian movement, like the Field Marshal of the Revolution. Hess's combination of left and right even managed to convert a U.S. government informant sent to spy on SDS and the youth radical movements. Don Meinhausen, a young Republican, a member of Young Americans for Freedom, the conservative student group launched from Bill Buckley's Sharon, Connecticut estate in 1960, had been charged with reporting back to the House Internal Security Committee on the likes of Hess, but was converted to libertarianism by him instead. Good job, Karl. He eventually confessed to his new buddy Carl that he was spying on SDS but realized it wasn't right. Hess convinced Meinhausen he should make one more report, a public testimony in which he announced he was recanting his services. He borrowed Hess's typewriter to compose a statement saying that, during my membership in SDS, I learned of a much more dangerous organization which has seized and destroyed more lives and property than SDS ever could. I am speaking of the United States government. He said his new philosophy came not from Marx, but from the revolutionary American tradition of liberty expressed by Jefferson, Webster, Thoreau, Josiah Warren, Benjamin Tucker, Lysander Spooner, Twain, and others. This public turning of a government spy, covered in the New York Times no less, was a triumph, and Hess's radicalism grew more intense. He became a public tax protester in 1969, and closing with his 1040, a letter reading in part, "The federal government of the United States of America today is guilty of exactly every sort of infringement, abuse, and denial stated as intolerable by the Declaration of Independence. I cannot, in conscience, sanction that government by the payment of taxes." For the rest of his life, Hess was unable to earn any legal income or own property in his own name. Refusing to pay taxes is not a laughing matter, he noted in his second autobiography. It has cost me a mint of money, left me pretty much destitute, and caused a terrible amount of trouble for my family and for other friends. Wow, he has courage of convictions to a point that I don't have. I mean, I'm going to be honest. I read that and I'm like, oof, you know? Despite this victory for publicizing the libertarian cause, Hess's ideological peccadillos and passion for counterculture living and protesting as adjuncts to anti-state philosophizing precipitated a break with Rothbard. Hess was one of Rothbard's partners in early issues of the Libertarian Forum. He was Washington editor. The split over Rothbard's growing enmity toward the New Left movement, particularly over Rothbard's public criticisms of the Black Panthers, came so abruptly that Hess's name had to be blotted out by hand on the May 1st, 1970 issue. The two most prominent faces of the activist libertarian underground were never again united. I'm going to need to see if I have that May 1st issue with the blotted out name. I will show you guys if I do. I'm marking that page to double check that. I don't have many issues of the Libertarian Forum, but I do have some. We have the illusion of freedom only because so few ever try to exercise it. Try it sometime. Try to save your home from the highway crowd, or work a trade without the approval of the goons, or to open a little business without a permit, or to grow a crop without a quota, or to educate your child the way you want, or not to have a child. We all have the freedom of a balloon floating in a pin factory. Wow. That's rough. That's rough reality right there, but it is reality, isn't it? Now it's moving into a new chapter with the title, Kill the Lazy Fairies. But most of the, it's a subchapter, not a new chapter. We're still on the whole Goldwater chapter. But most of the quasi-mass libertarian activism in the last years of the 1960s was conducted under the aegis of Young Americans for Freedom. Though dedicated to a Buckleyan kill the commies conservatism and engendered by a very unlibertarian fight for loyalty oaths, YAF attracted in the wake of Goldwater many liberty-loving individualists, among them many Randians who found themselves leaning more libertarian than conservative. And then YAF had a libertarian caucus going into its 1969 convention in St. Louis, led by Don Ernstberger from Pennsylvania. Ernstberger's group was independent of the New York Rothbardians and openly repudiated the message of Rothbard's article, Listen, YAF, that had just appeared in Libertarian Forum. An open call for all libertarians to leave YAF forthwith. Get out. Form your own organization. breathe the clean air of freedom, and then take your stand proudly and squarely, not with the despotism of the power elite and of the government of the United States, but with the rising movement in opposition to that government. Going into St. Louis, the Libertarian Caucus simply wanted more libertarians in the national YAF organization, and for YAF to consider stronger positions on ending the drug war and supporting draft resistance, not merely opposing the draft, which YAF had always done. Walter Block and other Rothbardians, Hess and his son Karl Hess IV, and others from the Anarchist Caucus, only a third or so as large as Ernstberger's less confrontational Libertarian Caucus, all descended on St. Louis, many in a manic and fondly remembered bus ride from New York City. Hess, denied a place on the official program for the convention, gave a midnight speech under the St. Louis Arch calling for YAFers to truly embrace the freedom in their name and abandon the conservatism that dominated them. The Libertarian Caucus tried running its own slate of candidates for national office, even as the national office was purging Libertarian-dominated delegations left and right, continuing a pattern begun earlier that summer. The blood flowing between the trads and the rads was bad and getting worse. Then a symbolic gesture was made on the convention floor that many who were energized by it mark as the beginning of the modern libertarian movement. Indeed, some drama-minded characters saw it as the moment when light first broke through the black iron prison and liberty began to peek, however tentatively, through. A Rashomon of memories surrounds this highly charged event, and here's a synthesis. And I'm going to read to you this entire synthesis as I think it's important. 4 different people are said to have had a hand in the provocation. At the urging of the Don Meinhausen, pagan-minded and conscious of the need for some sort of magical summoning action, David Schumacher got a facsimile of a draft card. Burning it wasn't illegal yet, from a California libertarian operating in the underground by the name of Sky Diarosis, editor of the major libertarian amateur press association, Libertarian Connection. Diarosis, now operating under the name of Dirk Pearson, became a best-selling author and creator of a cultural and business revolution of sorts in the early 1980s, in partnership with fellow libertarian Sandy Shaw with their book Life Extension, A Practical Approach. The lighter was provided by Jarrett Wolstein, then running an objectivist libertarian organization called the Society for Rational Individualists. The symbol of YAF is the torch of liberty, Meinhausen recalled. Dave became that symbol by lighting that draft card. And then the oppression inherent in the YAF system manifested itself in roars, shouts, shoving, waving fists, a rushing mass of bodies, eager to smash in lazy fairy noses. Lazy fairies had become the trads' favorite childish insult to the rads. Hess Jr. and some of his anarchist comrades formed a protective phalanx for Schumacher as they pushed their way out, through corridors and out the building, and decided, shades of Oswald, to slip into a movie theater until the heat eased up. The movie showing was, as Hess Jr. recalls, one with both anarchist and nihilist overtones, an allegory about an authoritarian English boarding school whose climax involves students shooting from the parapets of their old school down at a graduation ceremony. Hess Jr. thought it a propitious movement for the strange moment of metaphorically shooting from the parapets at authoritarian institutions. By the time the anarchist cabal got back to the convention hotel, angry YAFers were still running down the halls, shouting for lazy fairy blood. According to Tuchil's account, a mob of libertarians did some counter-mob angry stalking down hotel corridors. The conference theme was "Sock it to the left," where the libertarians and anarchists wanted to sock it to the state. By the time it was over, as far as the model YAF member was concerned, libertarians and anarchists were the left. Any YAFer who was also a member of SDS was expelled. Before the convention was over, all the libertarian factions, the Libertarian Caucus and Anarchist Caucus, and the California crew had met and exchanged addresses and committed to remaining in contact. contact. And I can see viewing that as the flashpoint that started it, that started the complete separation. I would have loved to have been there. And at that time, and it talked about this message scrawled on a sloppy mimeograph sheet, that it seemed like the world, literally the state, the world, everything was falling apart, and that they might really have a chance to put it back together, and correctly this time. All right, next sub-chapter that is coming up, and it might be the last sub-chapter. I'm taking a look. This was a really, no, it's not. See, there's one more after. Oh, no, there's multiple ones. Hope springs eternal, but we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. This next subchapter is called This Horseshit is Precisely Why the Anarchists Lost Out in 1917 to the Bolsheviks. And that's where we will be starting when I return. Okay, continuing. Newer faces on the Rothbard scene included Roy Childs, a brilliant autodidact from Buffalo. At age 19, Childs had lectured at Lefebvre's Rampart College in its last days, though he later turned violently against Lefebvre for his Gandhian lack of belief in even retaliatory force, and had won notoriety in the buzzing community of small libertarian zines by having the nerve to write an open letter to Ayn Rand telling her she was mistaken about government, that objectivism necessarily implied anarchism, since the state could not deny competing private defense agencies the liberty to operate without violating what under objectivist ethics were supposedly inviolable individual rights. And that is an excellent essay. They should probably read in full at some point on my channel. And I absolutely agree with it. And Walter Block entered the scene at this point as well. It says, the network of libertarian zines and student organizations got thicker before and after the YAF break, but it was still small enough that every time one libertarian found another, it was a cause for great encouragement and joy, even if it led to schisms and excommunications. The Rothbard began its own official organization, the Radical Libertarian Alliance. Its slogan was, war is murder, taxation is theft, conscription is slavery, government is chaos. Jerome Tuchil was a former Wall Street Journal writer and budding novelist, one of the libertarian children of the Goldwater campaign. And by this point, Rothbard's left-right fusion was dissolving in clouds of acrid smoke from the agents of their enemy, the state. Rothbard's disenchantment with his new left allies was complete when Columbus Day weekend was over. And I'm trying to figure out what weekend this was. Let me see here. I'm not exactly sure. But it's before the formation of the Libertarian Party. So we're talking, and after the YAF breakdown, so 1970-ish. They were in the main too flaky for him to deal with, too adventurous, not really convertible to the live and let live, yet system-smashing possibilities of strict proprietarian anarcho-capitalism. Potential cadres, such as Joe Cobb from the University of Chicago, the final editor of the New Individualist Review, were busy writing about how, come the revolution, libertarian property rights were going to be meaningless without constant control and protection. I wonder if that's the same Joe Cobb I know. However, much libertarians were trying to look, talk, and act left back then. Meinhausen remembers that the libertarian activists didn't really fit into the zeitgeist. One reason that young libertarians failed to make significant inroads into the larger world of youth radicalism at the time, theorizes political historian Jonathan Schoenwald, was that the overwhelmingly white male movement had little interest in or understanding of specifically black or female concerns, judging from the contents of most of its periodicals at the time. However, libertarians would insist their brand of illegitimately illegitimate hierarchy toppling economic and personal freedom was all blacks or women really needed. And we still, I think, suffer from that problem today. And I'm not so sure if it's actually a problem or that can, if something's actually a problem, it can be cured. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Or is it, in fact, that is all blacks or women really need? I tend to say it is, but judging by our numbers, I could be mistaken and that there's something I am missing here. Leonard Liggio thinks that many misunderstood Rothbard's intent into the late 1960s, both then and in writing about it later. He didn't want to turn the libertarian movement into a movement of the left. Murray was, of course, speaking to various groups, including left-wing groups, Liggio recalls. I think Tuchel saw that as the strategy itself. I think it was more that Murray was trying to create a center of people who understood and accepted his ideas, and he tried to go to different places to present it. It was neither left nor right. It was libertarian ideas, and he was presenting them to who would respond to them. He wasn't trying to catch the radical left or the Nixon right. He just wanted to present his views. The strategy was merely to find people who understood. It says, the new right credo, libertarianism. That's the next sub-chapter heading. Even after the Hess-Rothbard split, and the failure to effectively yoke libertarian ideas to new left activism, the early 1970s were still heady times for the libertarian movement, featuring breakthroughs and public attention that would have seemed miraculous a decade earlier. Publications from Newsweek to The Nation took wondering notice of this new anarchist strain on the right. Carl Hess, as noted, was lengthily, respectfully profiled in the New York Times and Washington Post Sunday magazine sections. Two young student radicals from Columbia University, Stan Lair and Louis Rossetto, associated with the Radical Libertarian Alliance journal, The Abolitionist, wrote a cover story in January 1971 on the burgeoning libertarian movement for the New York Times Sunday magazines, with they themselves photographed on the cover, called The New Right Credo, Libertarianism. Decades later, Rossetto would launch a different kind of revolution when he started Wired magazine. They cut a fine Hessian figure, right-wing radical chic, hip without being threatening, and managed to out-left the left by pointing out how the state, not the market, is to blame for air pollution and the overuse of the automobile, and called for a return to a tort liability system to prevent pollution, rather than the current system whereby polluters can harm you with as much filth as they want, so long as the government says it's okay. Even William Buckley was not totally opposed to this new development. In a column commenting on the New York Times Magazine articles, he called Rothbard an affable and talented absolutist. Granted, the absolutization of freedom by these gentlemen is the oldest and most tempting heresy, but still, the radical libertarians have a great deal to contribute. He then wondered aloud why Nixon hadn't seen the freedom light on matters such as the draft, agricultural subsidies, and union monopoly. That may have been all media attention was worth in terms of bodies in the street. But beyond that attention, and ultimately beyond those bodies in the street, libertarian thinkers were vital in one of the apotheosis of 1960s consciousness, though not widely credited for it. When the draft ended in 1973, it was the final step in a push whose respectable roots were with University of Chicago economists and advocates. Young libertarian Jim Powell from New Individualist Review, who toured the country speaking out against the draft, a 4-day conference in December of 1966 of policy intellectuals and students about conscription at the University of Chicago, including Milton Friedman, former Rand insider Martin Anderson, a Nixon insider advisor in 1968, who helped convince candidate Nixon draft elimination was a great idea. As an after effect of Anderson's urging upon Nixon's taking office, a 15-member advisory committee with Milton Friedman as a member was named to contemplate the future of the draft, with the idea that they would come up with a realistic plan to replace it with an all-volunteer army. So that is an accomplishment of the time that libertarians are not often given proper credit for. So the next subchapter is entitled Lysander Spooner Died for Your Sins. The libertarians expelled from YAF after St. Louis, as well as the ones who left in disgust, merged with Jarrett Wolstein's Society of Rational Individualists to form the Society for Individual Liberty, which was born as SDS was dying. Within a year, SDS would blow itself to bits as the weathermen exploded the Greenwich Village safe house where they had been making bombs. With the exception of Steve Sims, and we talked about him, I credited him as the first elected libertarian, a former senator whose anarcho-libertarianism dissolved after he took office, though he was one of the prominent supporters for re-legalization of gold ownership, and Rohrabacher. None of them achieved obvious political power. The ecumenical spirit, along with the smelly revolutionaries with unwashed hair that it attracted, alarmed some former Rothbardians. Gary North, who we talked about before with the Russus Rushdoony. Oh, and that's coming up. Gary North, an acolyte and son-in-law of Christian Reconstructionist theoretician R.J. Rushdoony, yet for all that a big fan of Baldy Harper and Rothbard, and an early player in the world of ideologues and salesmen who forged, influenced by libertarian economists all the way, the hard money movement, attended one of those CLA Lefebvre festivals at Cal State Long Beach, and he saw the dark smoke of hell rising all around him. I bet he did. Mises was speaking, and North thought he could get the great man to condemn his prodigal son by asking him publicly if he could abide Rothbard's anarchism and seemingly lefty turn. The moderator refused to pass on the question to the hard-of-hearing Mises. Free markets were fine for some things, but not for sins, such as drugs, North believed. Secular libertarianism, North had come to believe, was suicidal. And there's just a funny statement here. The libertarian movement has turned from 50 libertarians selling books to each other to 15 libertarians exchanging magazine subscriptions with each other. And in comes Reason magazine. And their first big circulation boost from 400 to 4,000 came in 1972, when they nabbed the first major interview with Nathaniel Branden after his break with Ayn Rand. When libertarians weren't reading magazines, they were attending meetings, supper clubs, which popped up in most major cities, where 50 to 100 libertarians would gather to eat, debate, and hear speeches on matters libertarian, and bigger conferences for all day or all weekend slates of libertarian talk and debate. John Mueller started a Libertarian Bookstore in 1972 in Greenwich Village with Sharon Presley, one of the founders of the Berkeley Alliance for Libertarian Action. As Mueller told Andrea Rich, and boy, these are all names that have come up now in my Liberty, LP time capsule. Andrea Rich, what a prominent female early founder. Sharon Presley is still around, is one of the founders of the Association of Libertarian Feminists. She hates my guts. That's another story, but a very bold, influential, early female movement leader who later bought the operation from him and turned it into a successful mail-order business that's still around today, though no longer run by Rich. Andrea Rich has since passed away, I think, since the time of this book. It was either that or pick up a gun. Libertarians have always been more likely to head to a bookstore than an armory, which some think is half the problem. Right? That's it for that section. The next subtitle or subchapter is This Kind of Absurd Answer to the Problem of Social Protection and Defense. And I'm just seeing that is the last subchapter. And so then I'll be putting these all into one thing and getting it to you. I'll let you know what the next full chapter will be that I need to read. Okay, now we are in our last sub-chapter, which talks about
Rothbard winning his first and only major contract from a New York trade publisher to write a book, and it was For a New Liberty, which was first published in 1973, which is very interesting timing with the LP starting just a few years earlier, with a revised edition in 1978. The book was meant both as a primer and a manifesto, so Rothbard crammed in as much of his overall theory of liberty as he could, and I'm glad that he did. Rothbard presents a thought experiment to show how absurd the state's pretensions would seem if we hadn't been saturated in an intellectual atmosphere, in most cases through schools run by the state, in which it received the benefit of every doubt. Suppose that we were all starting completely from scratch, and that millions of us had been dropped down upon the earth fully grown and developed from some other planet. Debate begins as to how protection, police and judicial services would be provided. Someone says, let's give up all of our weapons to Joe Jones over there and to his relatives, and let Jones and his family decide all disputes among us. And that way, the Joneses will be able to protect all of us from any aggression or fraud that anyone else may commit. With all the power and all the ability to make ultimate decisions on disputes in the hands of Jones, we will be protected from one another. And then let us allow the Joneses to obtain their income from this great service by using their weapons and by exacting as much revenue by coercion as they shall desire. Surely in that sort of situation no one would treat this proposal with anything but ridicule, for it would be starkly evident that there would be no way in that case for any of us to protect ourselves from the aggression or the depredations of the Joneses themselves. It is only because we have become accustomed over thousands of years to the existence of the state that we now give precisely this kind of absurd answer to the problem of social protection and defense. Says Rothbard hits the harder anarcho-capitalism stuff, but slips it in so smoothly that many readers may not notice that this libertarian manifesto promotes anarchism. And going on, the point of the anarchistic arguments is not to show exactly how the anarchistic utopia will solve every problem with the utmost efficiency and no rights violations. He merely wanted to show that there's no reason to believe that trying to solve the problems of defense and adjudication without a single monopoly source of force would result in a situation any worse than we have now, and probably better. He admits an inescapable conclusion of his own theories of property rights and invasion, that pollution of any sort is always a rights violation, one for which the victim should be able to sue for damages and cessation in a libertarian court. The state, Rothbard asserts, has blocked us from doing this by in most cases deciding that the cases of pollution are public goods and we just have to suck up whatever they put out. Such a hardcore proprietarian line on pollution might seem to mean the end of industrial civilization. Rothbard thinks that even raising that concern is a monstrous moral dodge. The argument that such an injunctive prohibition against pollution would add to the costs of industrial production is as reprehensible as the pre-Civil War argument that the abolition of slavery would add to the costs of growing cotton, and that therefore abolition, however morally correct, was impractical. For this means that the polluters are able to impose all of the high costs of pollution upon those whose lungs and property rights they have been allowed to invade with impunity. A court regime properly tough on pollution, he maintains, would spur the invention of new pollution control technologies far more efficiently than do government ukases. The only remedy is to force the polluting invaders to stop their invasion and thereby to redirect technology into non-polluting or even anti-polluting channels. Anarchism was the craze in libertarian thinking in the early 1970s, and not just from the Austrian natural rights Rothbard or objectivist anarchists like Roy Childs. The first big anarchist home to hit the market, or to hit the movement, beating Rothbard's Power and Market, which had been written a decade or more earlier, to print by a year, was The Market for Liberty by Morris and Linda Tannehill, a pair who dropped out of the movement and then dropped out of society. Their book gives a detailed picture of how a moral, stateless society might work. Their thinking was in a similar Randian vein to Childs's. In tackling the tricky for anarchists problem of national or large group defense and the free rider problem that paying for it voluntarily creates, Friedman points out that the intriguing datum that tipping in taxicabs, almost purely a situation of paying for a public good because of social expectations, is widespread and amounts to over 100 million a year. This indicates to Friedman that most people, in reality, don't get carried away with the economic benefits of free riding and neglect public goods when a developed social rule dictates that we should do the right thing. And then here's the closing paragraph of the chapter, leading into a chapter I think we might have all been waiting for. But there are other potential ways to spread libertarianism beyond educating one mind at a time. There is also political action. Out west in Colorado, as David Friedman was conceptualizing this book, a fellow ex-YAFer survived the rubble of the revolutionary 1960s, stared Nixon in his baleful dark eyes, and knew that libertarianism needed something new, something beyond a magazine, a book, or even a street demonstration. It was time for a libertarian party. Bum, bum, bum. So the next chapter is Libertarian Zionism, the Koch Bubble, and America's third largest political party. It is, as I always like to let you know ahead of time, how long. Well, this is a much shorter one. So it's just over 50 pages. And that is what we will be tackling next. And looks like we're just over halfway through the book.